Hey everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Apple is brought to you by Elderwood Academy. Elderwood Academy are the makers of fine products that you can use at your table. I'm talking about deck boxes, I'm talking about dice rolling trays and towers, dice themselves, and so much more. But today, I want to talk to you about dice catapults. That's right, if you go on to Elderwood Academy, your dice might be lonely right now, right? You might be playing a lot of games virtually online, rolling those digital dice. Well, guess what? You want something fun to do with your dice? Go to elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split and check out the Dice Catapult Kit. This will let you launch dice across the room. It is super fun, really quick to build yourself. You punch out the shapes, bada bing, bada boom, you're good to go. Apply a couple rubber bands and you're launching dice left and right. So go check it out at elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split. That's elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, I am talking with the one and only Mike Shea and Scott Gray about our Kickstarter for Fantastic Lairs. That's right, Mike, Scott, and me all have a Kickstarter going that will give you boss battles and short lairs to drop into any 5e D&D game. It was a blast to work on this with these two geniuses, and we talk a lot about the project in this upcoming interview, as well as what you can do to make awesome boss battles in your D&D games. It is a really, really fun conversation, and it's a great product. You can check out more at fantasticlairs.com. That's fantasticlairs.com to go check out the Kickstarter. All right, here's my conversation with Mike and Scott. Okay, everybody, now I am here with two of my very most favorite people in the world of role-playing games and in the world in general. Scott, for people who don't know, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
You promised there would be no gotcha questions, James.
I'm still wrapping my head around very most favorite people.
That's right.
I guess that's why we need an editor.
My name is Scott Gray. I am a freelance editor and designer and developmental editor and story editor and fiction writer. On the RPG side of things, I've been editing for tabletop RPGs, largely for Wizards of the Coast since about 2004. I was very privileged to be one of the editors who worked on the 3 5th edition core rulebooks. I was the editor of the Monster Manual, edited about half of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and did a little bit of work on the Player's Handbook as well. And here tonight because I'm working on a new book, a new project, with two very exciting people.
Oh, wow. Yes, that's right. Jack Kaiser and Derek Ruiz.
There we go. Two amazing artists, and we got a couple of word people as well. I can't remember.
Word slingers.
Yeah.
Who are very lucky to have Scott.
Yeah, no kidding.
And Mike, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role?
Oh, who is anybody really? I think I made that joke last time I was on the show too. Right? I'm Mike Shea. I write lots of Dungeons and Dragons stuff. I wrote for Wizards of the Coast a while back. I worked on a project with Scott Gray a few years ago called Vault of the Dracolich. He and I and Teo Sabadia worked on that. That was the first D&D Next playtest adventure, I think. And that is certainly the first one that is published and available on the DM's Guild. And yeah, I wrote a book called The Lazy Dungeon Master and a sequel to it called Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master was edited by none other than Scott Gray. And I write a website called Sly Flourish that's been around for about more than about 11 years now.
Yeah, and is a frequent guest of this podcast as well, because Mike's always got something cooking. Well, it's great to have you both here. Obviously, this is going to be a little bit of a different podcast because I'm involved this time in the project.
You're not involved. You're a partner. Right? The three of us are all partners.
I'm trying to give myself plausible deniability here.
I don't think that is going to work. There's nothing but bias on this show.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. So I am working with you all. We've partnered together to create Fantastic Lairs, which the day this podcast goes live is on Kickstarter, which means that you can go right now to fantasticlairs.com or over to the show notes for this episode to get a direct link to the Kickstarter. And it is a book of boss battles and climactic encounters for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So, Mike, I'm going to throw it over to you to talk about where the idea for Fantastic Lairs came from, because I know I came to you and said, like, oh, I'd love to work with you on something. But you were the one who originally pitched this idea. You said, oh, yeah, I've got this idea for boss battles.
I don't think that's true. I think that you and I, when we were knocking ideas around, one of us, I don't remember, we'd have to like go back to like old Google Hangout notes, right, to be sure. But I think that we had sort of two angles on this. And one of them was we really liked the 4th edition book, Dungeon Delve. And we hadn't seen, there are a lot of books that have like small dungeons and small adventures and things like that. But I don't think we saw anything that was quite what Dungeon Delve had done. That sort of small room, 3-room, with 3-room with a boss kind of thing. And I do think that, I have like a back burner list of things that I'm always sort of circulating on. And I think one of the things on there was something about, writing up D&D bosses that, when I looked at all of the things that DMs do, the work that DMs do to run great games, that boss fights are hard in particular. And then I write about this in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and Scott and I had talked about this while we were writing it, that, lots of areas of D&D you can improvise. And then there are a few areas of D&D that you can't improvise. And I argued that while you can improvise most of your encounters in D&D, right, even with monsters, you don't have to build like monster closets anymore like we did in 4th edition. You don't have to have like a nice room with a nice assortment of monsters that are all a particular challenge rating. With, nowadays you could just kind of say like, I don't know, there's goblins here, and then decide which goblins are in any room at any given time while you're improvising it. And that works pretty well up to a point. And that point is when you have a boss fight, when you have one of these knockdown, drag out fights that are intended to push the characters as hard as you can push them, but still give them a good, solid chance for victory. Bring up a villain that is somebody they love to hate and that they want to fight. That takes a lot of careful work, and it requires that the DM has their hands on certain dials while that fight is going on to make sure that it runs the way it runs. So we knew that part was hard, and I think, we had talked about this and knowing that we wanted to work together on a project and mentioning that we wanted to have Scott with us as well working on this, that you kind of solidified down to, why don't we do boss battles, right? Boss battles and the areas in which they sit.
Scott, the other day we were talking about this on another show, and Mike and I were going on and on about like, oh yeah, the hit points of the creature, and you want to, you can adjust, and you can make it so that you take them down in one hit when it feels like the fight is going on too long, and you can crank up those hit points when it feels like they're really, and talking about maximizing spell abilities and AC and things like that. And you brought it back to story in a way that I thought was like, oh, right. This is why it's really good to work with Scott, because any DM can look at hit points and max them out, right? Mike and I could write a tweet instead of a book.
I do that very often.
So I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about kind of the story focus of the product and our goals with that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think it's, just speaking to what Mike was just saying, talking about, like Mike and I met, as he said, when we worked on Vault of the Dracolich together. But like, I knew Mike's work as from his book, The Lazy Dungeon Master, before that. And it's not just the idea that it's easy to improvise a lot of a D&D game. To my mind, the best D&D games feature that kind of improvisation. They work with that idea of keeping things loose and keeping things flexible. maximizing the amount of prep that you can do to set up being able to take the game in as many different directions as humanly possible, right? And downplaying the kind of prep where you're locking yourself into big monolithic sort of lockstep encounters, right? And because those games are so interesting, the thing that really appealed to me about this book when you and Mike first approached me to talk about it was just the idea that this is an example of sort of looking at D&D as and RPGs in general as that sort of that shared storytelling experience, and saying what we're going to do here is we're going to give you the exciting climax of a story, and then you get to fill in all the bits that lead up to that and all the things that happen as a result of that. You get to build all the setup, you get to build the beat by beat, act by act structure that kind of leads into that. You get to work out the denouement. You get to figure out how the characters change, how the world of the story changes as a result of what goes on in this big climactic boss battle. And everything that we're putting into these everything that you guys are putting into these encounters is really kind of geared towards not just here's an exciting encounter, but how could this possibly hook into and spin off into the campaign in general? What interesting things does this set up in terms of how we're going to get to this encounter, and what interesting things does it set up in terms of what might happen after this, when the characters are finished with this part of the campaign, or when they're finished with this big adventure and they're going off into the next thing. And all of that to me is a really, really cool kind of process. And I liked the idea that I hadn't seen a book exactly like this before. And I liked the idea that over and above just being able to present cool mechanical stuff and say, here's a really cool layer design, here's a cool map, here's some cool traps and some cool environmental effects and some monsters which we've reskinned and fine-tuned in a slightly different way, so it'll keep your players on the edge and a little bit surprised, right? It's also about the interesting story elements that DMs and players alike are going to be able to kind of pull out of this and have fun with.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been a big focus too of like, what is each villain's story, and how do you come in and out of that story, right? And even like to the point of like, hey, this lair, right, which each lair is, between 3 and 5 rooms generally. Could this lair, where is it found? Is there more around it? If a DM even wants to build out the dungeon, they have that option, as well as just running it as is, which I think is pretty Dungeon Delve inspired, right?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, one of the big challenges of the project, and one of the things that's been the most interesting to me, is as the ideas have come together, and as we've been sort of assembling all these ideas for the layers and the layers, especially looking at the 2 layers that are in the sample that people can pick up if they're looking at the Kickstarter, is just this idea of we got one thing we're going to present, a fairly short encounter, fairly brief in terms of the page count and the word count, but we want to have as much flexibility as humanly possible before and after. We want people, to build an adventure around this thing if that's what they want to do, but we also have to leave it open enough that if they just want to run this, they can do that without worrying about what else is going on around it. And it's a really interesting kind of design space to go into, because it does, again, it reinforces or reflects that idea of designing sort of in that improvisational space where you don't want to lock too much stuff down. And the stuff that you do lock down, you want to make sure that as much as anything, like as much as the concrete details, it's also offering you the potential for where you want to go, more so than where you're going to be at any particular point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. I love the idea of, I've never been able to quite articulate it the way you said it, but the idea of designing an adventure so that not that you're putting people into a like good story, a good linear story, but more that you're covering the spread and giving them a lot of different ways to grow their own story on top of, is a brilliant design philosophy. Mike, let's talk a little bit about some villains.
Oh, man.
So the other day, somebody asked, where do you get your ideas for villains? So that preview Scott mentioned, one of them is a Fey-touched cockatrice.
Yeah.
Which is like not a thing that would enter my brain in a million years and is so cool.
Yeah. I mean, mashing idea. That's funny because that's Stephen King's most hated question. Right?
Oh yeah, where do you get your ideas?
Like, I don't know, everywhere, right?
Yeah.
I think he had a whole. I think Neil Gaiman answered it best when he was like, "A little man comes into my room, and hands me a small book every day, and tells me one day I'm going to have to pay for this."
Many years ago, Harlan Ellison had an answer to that question where he said he subscribed to an idea service out of Poughkeepsie, and he would actually, I think he would actually give people the address.
Go ask this guy. Yeah. They'll hook you up. They'll hook you up with some ideas. Yeah. But I think a lot of ideas. I think a lot of. I've heard that I've heard this is pretty common. Is mashing up ideas that exist, right? And I think D&D works really, really well. It's a fantastic way to mash up ideas. And like even for that one, I don't think I could put my finger down and say exactly when that happened, but I think it was the mixture of looking at the location where I wanted to set it and saying like, well, you don't want to just have a cave, right? Caves are, a general cave is boring. So I'm always asking like, well, what was it before, right? What happened there before?
Yes.
And I was like, well, I love gates. I love old gates to other worlds. It's just a cool thing, right? And it's another common sort of D&D thing. And I think I was watching Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell a little bit at the time, and so the idea of the Seelie and Unseelie Fae, and I thought, well, an Unseelie Fae gate would be kind of interesting. Like, what if we put that angle on it? And then I was looking at the cockatrice themselves as a combatant, and I was like, it's not a fantastic combatant on its own. I mean, granted, this is a level 1 adventure, right? So they can be shoved over with a stick. And I'm a big proponent for giant rats are absolutely ideal monsters for level 1 characters, whatever anybody says. And
that's got to be worked into every podcast, apparently.
It is now, because it's right. So. But so cockatrices get pushed over. But you want something interesting with the cockatrice. So I was like, well, what if, how do you mix the idea that there's this Unseelie Fae gate and that it's sort of broken and hasn't worked right? And then what if you had like, and this didn't all just kind of happen. This actually, I think through like I think it's the 4th version of the adventure, fourth version of the lair, where we're like, what if like generations of cockatrices have been bred next to this gate? And they were slowly changing and mutating as they were closer to this gate till they got some of that Fae-ish power, like the ability to Misty Step, as a bonus action on top of all of their other abilities. And then other weird effects that are going on in the cave. And sometimes it was like, sometimes you come up with an effect you want to have and you reverse engineer why that happened, right? So in the case of like, well, there's a whole bunch of statues that are sitting around here, some of which have been here for like hundreds of years. But if you look at the cockatrice stat block, it only knocks you out for like a day, I think, right? So like that, why would they be there hundreds of years? So then part of it is like, well, they're broken. And if they're broken, they can't come back because they're dead. But that's not actually in anything, right? And this is something where Scott came and said, there's, what if this place is causing that, right? What if the treatment of the Unseelie gate is causing this to occur? So we slightly tweak the text so that, so that's clear. So, one of the things that is really interesting about this is that, and fun about this book is that my hope is that we're kind of teaching how to fish, right? That we're showing a lot of techniques in this book that I'm hoping, I think we all hope, that DMs will add to their arsenal of dirty tricks, right? And that's one of them. And this is one that Scott, that Scott is bringing into this, which is like, if you want to add a new ability to a monster, what about the area is causing that? Like, you don't want to homebrew the monster forever, right? You don't want all cockatrices to come up with this new thing that if they petrify somebody and that person's arm breaks off, they're dead. Well, the way to do it is the combination of the monster and the place, or the monster and the other effects, right? Mixing these together is what causes that ability. And that way you're only doing it for that one spot. So that's a good tool for a DM to grab and take from this book into their other adventures.
Yeah, it really makes the boss monster like unique, right? When you fight a boss monster, I feel like you want it to be different. You want it to stand out, right? It's not just a cockatrice. It's this super Fae-touched cockatrice. We have a winged Naga on the cover, right? And like a Naga becomes 100% more scary when it can fly and shoot lightning bolts at you.
And has a Hydra pet.
Yeah, it does. It does. And the thing that I think, again, Scott, you were really good at this. So like Scott has a deep understanding of 5th edition and would say like, well, this can't happen the way you've written it. But if you want it to happen, here are some suggestions that are not only are they like good at fixing the problem, they're ultimately way more interesting than what you came up with.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but
yeah. Well, so could you, because like I've had a lot of editors sometimes say like, this can't happen because the D&D magic doesn't work this way or whatever it is. But you're very good at supplying the cheat, as it were.
Yeah, I can't remember where this. Can't remember. There's a certain phrase, and it's on the edge of my mind. I can't remember it, but it's something about the where the most interesting aspects of story happen are in the exceptions to what's expected, right? In the exceptions to what normally goes on. And again, like I harp on this a lot because I'm kind of a story geek. You know, I do think of tabletop RPGs as a storytelling medium, not in the sense that the DM is dictating a narrative that the players and the characters are obliged to follow, but in the sense that a group of people, DM and players alike, all with equal stakes, are producing a bit of narrative, you know, every time you sit down at the table, right? And in exactly the same way that, like at the beginning of any novel or at the beginning of any film or the start of any TV series, there's always an implicit understanding that the world of all the characters has been the same right up to this point, and at this point where you start watching, that's when things are going to change. That's when the big upheaval happens. That's when the big disaster happens. You know, something happens in the character's life, and that sort of spins the story off in new ways. And tabletop RPGs, I think, are much the same. You've got the characters up to a particular point, and they've been doing whatever they've been doing. But the very first adventure, when you sit down, you know implicitly the DM and the players have all sort of established a handshake agreement that in this session something is going to change in the lives of the characters. You know, it may be like a disaster if the adventure is coming to them. It may simply be that this is the point at which their previous decision to go out and become an adventurer, to become a hero, this is where they have the opportunity to take the first step, that sort of thing, right? But I think that idea also extends into things like monster design, things like working with villains, working with fronts, which are one of the ideas that Mike talks about in his books, which are taken from Dungeon World, if I'm remembering that correctly. Yeah, you know, so anytime you're looking at what's going on in the game, in the campaign, the most interesting points are always the points at which something changes. So if you have the idea that you want to work with a boss, or you want to work with, work with a cool kind of a lair where you want it to be interesting, you want the players to be engaged, you want the characters and the players alike to not really know 100% of what's going on. The simple answer is always just, you know, what are you going to change from the baseline, right? What are the expectations going into it? And this is especially acute for experienced players who know what monsters can normally do, right? Even if they've never fought those monsters, they may have read the monster manual, they've talked to other people about their games, right? There's always a sense of wanting to stay one step ahead of the players, but not in the sense of wanting to put one over on them, but simply wanting to surprise them in a pleasant way, right? To give them a little bit of a shake-up, to give them a little bit of a shock, and to make the story spin off in an interesting direction from that. And I think, yeah, like what you were talking about in terms of like, you know, it's always start with what you think would be interesting and cool. So always definitely start with, hey, wouldn't it be great if this Naga could fly? Right? And then figure out a way to make that Naga fly that actually fits within the scope of the game, right? Look at the other things going on. Look at how to mash up, you know, bits of different monsters. Look at, as Mike said, what the environmental effects might bring into it. Look for, you know, what magic items can do to monsters to really change their effectiveness in combat in really interesting ways, and just go crazy with it.
Yeah. I love the idea of like, you know, go crazy, especially when you're working with partners that you trust like this, right? Like I always feel like when I'm writing, like, is this too crazy? Is it? And I'm like, oh, well, you know, they're going to let me know. Like, they're going to let me know if this is bonkers or is this too boring, right? Like the other side of that sometimes is I struggle with like, I feel like I'm in this rut and I can only do what's expected. And then we'll have a meeting and I'll say, hey, I'm thinking about this. And then I'll have more ideas than I can fit into my word count of like what can be done, right? So it is great. It's great to be able to riff and share everything, because I know Mike and I, when we talk about like, oh, this chapter that I wrote or this chapter that Mike wrote, but we do really bounce everything back and forth.
Yeah, it's one of the. I mean, Mike mentioned that he and I first worked together and first met when we worked on Vault of the Dracolich. And Vault of the Dracolich for me still remains one of the best experiences I've ever had working on D&D. And this book certainly is a close second, and I expect we'll probably exceed it by the time we're done. But
sorry, Teos.
Yeah. Take that, Teos.
But strictly because the process of working on both those projects has been very much the same. I don't know how much people know about sort of the way that the design and development process normally works on an RPG book. But typically, at least for a company like Wizards of the Coast, if you're doing work for them, the designers and the developers and the editors, we all work on the same book, but we work on the book at different stages normally, right? There's always a certain amount of back and forth. People will ask questions. They'll go back if something's not clear. They'll talk about asking for revisions or trying to make sure that everything is as solid as it can be. But on Vault of the Dracolich, Mike and Teos and I were working on the book at the same time, right? So as we were all jamming on ideas, we were running stuff back and forth past each other, improving things as a result of that. We each had our own very distinct roles on the book, but we were working on it simultaneously, which doesn't happen that often. And that's exactly the same process that we're doing on this book here. And I think that's why this book, at least, it has been as much fun to work on as it has been so far. Just because there is that great sort of cross-pollination of ideas, right? It's like you throw something out that you're not, that feels okay, but you're not quite sure where to take it. And it's not that you're waiting for somebody else to give you the idea or to tell you where to go with it, but the conversation sort of inspires new ideas in a way that you might not have been able to come up with on your own. And part of the reason that's interesting for me is, as a design space, that kind of reflects the way that tabletop RPGs work as a general rule, because tabletop RPGs are interesting because you're getting ideas from other people. You're getting other people doing things and you're having to respond to that to come up with something you wouldn't have normally thought of or probably wouldn't have come up with on your own. So it's an interesting kind of a reflection of the creative process of putting an adventure book together, which when it's done is going to inspire, hopefully, that same sort of creative process in the people who are playing it, which I think is a pretty cool thing.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a quick break and then back to the babble.
Gather round, travelers, to hear our tale. Venture Maidens is an actual play 5th edition podcast made by 4 longtime friends and lifetime gamers. We take our role-playing as seriously as we keep our bulges tasteful. So if you're looking for an epic high fantasy tale spun by a killer cast, give us a shot. We publish new episodes every other week and live stream our game recordings on Twitch. Now get on out there and download Venture Maidens wherever podcasts are free. Hope to see you in the community, and don't forget to venture away.
Let's get back to the babble. Mike, one of the things that I have learned from you in a big way is kind of the sweet spot of boss encounters, right? There's this idea of you want the boss to feel tough, but you also want the players to feel like they have a chance against the boss. And that can be a tough thing to balance, right? Because you don't want the boss to go down in one hit. That's sort of an anticlimax, right? But you also don't want the boss to take out the players in one hit because that is just disappointing the other way. And, we do a lot of things in this book. There's usually some resource sinks before characters ever get to the boss, some other little skirmishes they might have or traps they might face or that kind of thing that soften them up and take away some of those big spells or whatever before they reach the boss. But the boss itself, how do we make an engaging boss creature to fight, right? The environment is definitely part of it that we've touched on, but the boss itself, how do we do that?
I mean, so there's a couple aspects, right? There's the story, like you make the bosses are interesting, particularly if you know about them ahead of time, and if they have a story, and that's something that we've definitely done in this book, is make sure that the bosses have reasons why they're doing the things they're doing, and that they have a background, and hopefully that background is something that the characters can hear about before they face it, and that way when they face it, they have, there's more meaning and context to that situation. And then there's the mechanical side, right? Which is making sure that the mechanics of the monster are meeting, and the mechanics of the boss are meeting that expectation, meeting the expectation that you would have for a boss, which is also really wide, because sometimes completely destroying a boss is really, really fun, right? Like, we love that scene in Indiana Jones where the swordsman swinging the sword around and he pulls out a gun and shoots him, right? And but there's also that difficulty of like, that's kind of how players want all boss fights to go, right? And they act that way. Like they blitz bosses as hard as they can with everything they've got, as fast as they can to meet that exact situation. Paladins will teleport over and pour every smite they have into one hit to just nuke the boss, right? And that can be fun, right? And can be memorable. So some of the stories of my players are moments where they completely destroyed a boss, where like the perfectly balanced boss fight can be kind of boring, right? And if it's a little too video gamey, that can also, it's like, well, I've done that before, right? I've fought the 3-stage boss before, I know what that's like. And so it's a wide range of what boss fights can, how those can end, and how that story can go, that will be memorable. And I think it's a real trick for a DM to kind of make sure that they can have that range, that they're not making everything too prescriptive, that the fight's going to go a certain way, right? And and it's something that DMs have to learn. So, I mean, one of the things that we're doing in this book is trying to make sure that there's flexibility built into the encounters. There's a lot of like, how do you tune the battle up and down, depending on the kind of, because no one, like, we've talked about this a lot, right? The challenge rating system in general, challenge rating and encounter building in 5th edition D&D is, probably one of its weak points, right? I'm being nice and being tactful. And so,
Scott was busy working on the Dungeon Master's Guide at that point.
I'm sure it was the other half of the DMG was the part that he was working on. He didn't, it's right up to that part. So, and part of it is by design, right? Like if it's too again, if the challenge rating system worked perfectly, it would be pretty boring, because it would mean that every challenge 4 monster is the same pretty much as every other challenge 4 monster. You always know what you're going to get. And that would be lame, right? We roll dice because we don't want things to be, we don't want things to be too uniform. We want the surprise and we want the chaos. So having like one challenge 4 monster that is harder than other challenge 4 monsters, or has this tendency in this certain area, and picking on the Banshee, right? Like Banshees are badass, and they're badass because their death move scales with level, right? Like it doesn't matter how high level you are. They'll take all your hit points if they succeed, right? So they get 10, 20 times harder when your hit points go up from 20 to 200, 10 to 200. So because we don't know how a boss fight's going to go, the only person who has any chance of understanding what the capabilities of the characters are is the DM that's running it, right? They've seen them go through these. So what we try to do in this is make sure that the dial, I keep calling them like the dials are in the book that a DM can turn to tune a battle up or tune it down. Some of those dials you can turn during a fight to get the right effect. If things are stale and boring, suddenly the hit points of the monsters go down while the damage goes up, right? And like, whoa, these guys got scary, but at least we're taking them down quickly. And, then finding what are the story reasons that those take place. I have the one that I used is the helmed horror that not in this book, but in other circumstances, the helmed horror who can set himself on fire, thus reducing his AC, but increasing the amount of damage he does. Right. And you're like, oh my God, did that helmed horror just burst into flame? Like, yes, he did. Right. So yeah. So having those tricks, and again, kind of helping the DM recognize that those tricks are available in general. So that if you have a situation where like you really wanted this boss to be something special and it just got, banished on a single hit, and it's now in another plane, and the characters are all like, what do we do for the next 10 minutes? Yeah, those are all real tricks that I don't think there's any one perfect solution to solve, by that very nature if it's a chaotic game and that chaos is fun. But hopefully we give enough tools to the DM to be able to tune that as well as they can to get the kind of expectation from the players that they want.
Yeah, it's that same design philosophy that Scott was talking about with story applied to battle, right? Like, give the DM a lot of different tools based on how the encounter may go, so that you've got some surprises if you want to surprise your players. If your players are having fun kicking the crap out of this thing, then let that roll, and go from there. Scott, this book isn't all hack and slash either. We've got some good story elements, and we've got some, I guess you would call them objectives that are not always kill the boss, right? That can be laid in there. There's something to destroy, there's something to save, there's that kind of thing, and that also gives the boss like a chance to get away or threaten something, right?
Yeah, there's lots of options. I mean, one of the toughest things about designing this book, as we've talked about elsewhere, I think, was just the idea of knowing that we have such a narrow focus, knowing that we're zooming in on this one very specific part of an adventure or a larger campaign, and having absolutely no idea how that's going to fit in with the campaign or the adventure that any DM who picks the book up is likely to be running. So talking again about having to make sure that there's lots of hooks, lots of options, lots of ways to get into this encounter, lots of ways to go out of it, right? At the end of the day, what we tried to do, I think, for all of these lair encounters, all of these boss battles, is to try to put as many possible options in as we could, so that any DM who's looking at it should be able to see, ideally, a completely different encounter setup than the next DM who looks at it. That would be a really great thing. Like, if that's the kind of feedback we ultimately get on the book, that I think will be something pretty cool. Because it's a tough thing to do, and it doesn't always happen. I mean, we all know that DMs can sort of strip ideas out of published adventures a lot, which is perfect. That's exactly what published adventures are for, right? Published adventures should almost never be played exactly as written under most circumstances, and we're doing that in this book, but with a slightly different focus, I think, and that's been part of the challenge of how it got put together, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of feedback that we get. One thing I wanted to ask you, James, just because you're sitting in the interviewer seat and you're not getting to talk as much as Mike and I do, talking about, as we were before, like the things that Mike was talking about how to put a boss together and how to make the boss memorable and the environmental stuff. Your sample adventure, which is in the preview, does a lot of really, really cool stuff with that, including one of the favorite, I think Mike and I both loved this when you first set it up, the idea that the boss's most apocalyptic attack only happens after the boss is dead, which is a lot of fun, I thought.
Yeah, well, I like that moment that we often get in movies of like the lair collapsing or exploding, or a giant wave of acid coming through that the heroes then have to outrun. It gives the boss a negotiating trick, I think. If the GM wants to have a clever boss say, strike me down, and then some really bad stuff is going to happen, right? You've got that. But it's also fun to have we thought we were done, and now we're not. And what are we going to do now? Because Mr. Nova Paladin has wasted all his smites and doesn't have any spell slots left to get us the heck out of here, or whatever it is, right? So yeah, that's a lot of fun to think about. And it is honestly, for me, I want to do it in every adventure that I ever write. So it was fun to be able to actually do it for one of these, because I think a lot about like lairs as homes, right? And that a lot of people have security systems, particularly if you're up to nefarious, illegal things. And if clever players are able to stop this doomsday device thing from happening, then you get a pretty cool reward for it, which is the lair itself. Yeah, it's really fun, and it's been fun to work with both of you. I have been fans of both of you for a very long time. And so the chance to work with both of you, for me is, I feel like I'm fanboying a bit, right? Like, it's like, oh, wow, I have so many books with these people's names on them behind me on my shelf as I'm working. So yeah, that is a lot of fun for me.
I don't think the ratio of names to books is equal in all areas. I definitely have more books with your names in it than the reverse.
I don't think that's true. Plus, I mean, combined, like, you could take every book we've ever written, and Scott out by a mile. Scott outshines us just in D&D titles, not to mention all of his work outside D&D. So he's legit.
I think it's safe to say we are all fans of each other.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's which is nice, right? That makes it really fun.
Well, that's another thing that's really made this a fun project to work on. Is just the fact that we're all very much on the same page in terms of liking each other's work, liking the same types of works from other people. You know, I mean, even though I'm sure we play the game in very different ways, you know, each in our own way. Our sense of what the game should be, our sense of how the game should be fun, I think, is very much in sync, and that's been a really cool part of this project as well.
It's true. You know what, Scott, I did say there'd be no gotcha questions, but I do have one for you. Where do you stand on the lethality of level 1 play in Dungeons and Dragons?
As I typically do, I will answer that question in like 4 different ways to hide the fact that I don't think there is an answer. I think level 1 in 5th edition is really deadly. I think that's a reasonable point to make. I don't think there's any way to really go around that. I think there are 2 approaches, and the approach to whether you think lethality at first level is okay depends on not so much the game, but on the players. And one of the big differences between different editions of D&D, I won't even say the differences between 5th edition and earlier editions, because there's been certain aspects of this from 3rd edition on, is the fact that it's very easy to be more invested in creating a character in the later editions, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, than it was in earlier editions. The earlier editions were more lethal at lower levels when you rolled your 1d4 to find out how many hit points your magic user had. And if your magic user had 1 hit point, then your magic user had 1 hit point, right? That was how the game was played. But one thing that's really easy to forget, especially for people who are not as seriously middle-aged as I am, who didn't start out with AD&D, is that when we played AD&D, and original D&D, you created characters like crazy because it was fast to create a character. It was fun to create a character. You very often played with 2 or 3 characters at a time. Like in one session, you'd be running multiple PCs, right? You very often, you know, if you like, you'd roll up characters, you'd play one session with them, and you'd roll up new characters for the next session just because you were bored with the first ones, right? So by the time you got up to the sweet spot levels, 3rd, 4th, 5th, when things, you know, started to stabilize a little bit in terms of your character's ability to survive, right? You were basically picking the cream of the crop. You were taking the characters who had survived up to that point, right? So they'd been lucky enough or they'd been strong enough to actually be able to kind of deal with what was thrown at them. And so by that point, you know, lethality from that point on wasn't as big a deal because it was more sort of like you understood and accepted the risks, and you could choose to sort of, you know, balance off what risks you wanted to take versus how likely it was your character would be killed. And the issue nowadays is that it's really easy to get invested in making a brand new character, especially for people who are coming into the game for the first time, people who don't have that experience of characters seeming disposable as they did back in the day. And the one reason that I think it's often best to err away from first level lethality in a game is because if you have players who are really invested in a character, they put a lot into thinking about this character, they really want to make this character their entry point into the game. If that character dies too quickly, or worse, dies in a dumb way, okay, not like a heroic sacrifice, you know, I will, you know, leap on this, you know, this Fey touch cockatrice to save my friends, right? But just dying like a mook, just
like getting an eye infection.
Yeah, you're stepping on a caltrop, and you're
Right.
and your last one hit, your last hit point goes, that sort of thing. It can really have a negative effect on the player, right? Because the player is going to walk away from that session feeling like, I really wanted to be invested in this, and I felt like I had something taken away from me. And I don't think that's an excuse to soften play, right? But at the same time, especially for the combination of new players and first level characters, I think it's worthwhile being very, very careful.
What would you say if you have a bunch of players who are min-maxing jerks like Mike does? I've played at his table.
Yeah. I think for experienced players who kind of know the ropes, I think anything goes. I think under those circumstances, it can be fun to play like a real kind of abattoir style first level campaign, where you just like your characters just kind of line up and get mowed down, and you just roll up new characters and off you go. That can be fun in and of itself if the players are in the right mindset. And really what it comes down to is trying to understand the mindset that your players are in to figure out whether they will enjoy that kind of risk.
If people are wondering why I'm asking Scott this, check out our Caves of the Cockatrice preview and look at the first sidebar that comes up.
Yeah. I have so much I want to say, but I'm biting my tongue. I'll just say I agree with Scott.
It's funny. I find myself agreeing with Scott as well.
How about that?
That's the advantage of answering your question 4 different ways. Is everyone
I agree with part of what he said.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I think that is true, and I do agree that if you have new players, you should definitely feel them out about that, especially with level 1.
Be nice. Be nice,
and be nice to yourself too. Be kind to yourself, and if what you like is to hear the cracking bones of a level 1 halfling rogue.
You're brand new players like, you know what? I don't really like Dungeons and Dragons. I'm gonna go play my video games again.
Oh, that's excellent. So before we go, I do want to get from both of you, like, what are you just most excited about in the book Fantastic Lairs? We have some I will say we've got some great artists who are working on this, so I'm really looking forward to showing off some of the art to everybody. Again, all of that you can check out if you go to fantasticlairs.com and go to the Kickstarter. Jack Kaiser and Derek Ruiz we mentioned earlier. But we've also got some other awesome artists who we have been working with as well.
Yeah, we've got a really good group of people, many of whom I haven't worked with before, or I've there's a couple that I've worked once or twice with. So yeah, no, it's the art looks really amazing. Really happy with how the book is going to look. I like the fact, like I said earlier, that it's a book that feels like it's not exactly the same as any other book that's out there, and I think it's going to be kind of interesting on that level. And I think there's lots of stuff in it for lots of different types of games, lots of different, styles of DMing. Yeah, I think people are going to enjoy it. So at the end of the day, that's really, all that I'm kind of looking for. So
yeah, there's one part of it that I am both kind of dreading, but I know will really matter, and that's testing, right? That we are eventually going to put all of these layers through playtesting from groups that aren't us. And I think particularly because it's boss battles and we know that they can go in many different ways, I think it's really important that we do so, and that and that the playtesting we get back from that works its way back in. I think we're lucky not having a big publishing house kind of sitting above us on this, that like we can wait till we get it right. Like we can plan that out and make sure that the time that we take to test that out, it will affect the final product. It is not like, we get 2 weeks and whatever we get in 2 weeks, we're done. That testing will really matter. It's something that, I've done on previous work and worked really well. And to me, that is really an aspect that DMs can't do on their own. Like when we talk about like what the value of this book is and how it's important that we make sure that what's in here is the kind of thing a DM can't just do. Well, they're not going to commission art like we are, right? We're giving them beautiful artwork that they can then show to their players. Beautiful full color maps, right? That we've designed, that all of us have kind of cut on and redesigned and then had professional cartographers put together for us. That's something they can't do. And I think another big aspect is testing, right? Like, there are some dirty tricks for DMs to be able to sort of play test a boss monster before they run it for real. But it's not often that's done. And I think us testing all of these things, and I know as a customer, that's probably the number one thing I look for now is like, who else ran this? And when I see a product like Empire of the Ghouls from Kobold Press, and I open it up and it's got a page worth of group names and individual names of people who play tested the adventures, I'm like, okay, good. Right? Like, I'm glad to see that, because it's one thing to write an adventure. It's something else to have played it and have other people play it and have it come back, solid. So, yeah. So I think that's looking forward to or happiest with isn't really the exact thing. But I think the thing that is going to end up being potentially the most valuable might be that.
Just as I said before, I think just the fact that it's it's going to be a kind of a unique little product. I think it's going to have be something pretty special. I think it's got its own very special space. And I think, if nothing else, I guess one thing I do hope is that the way that we've set the book up, the way we've structured it, the way that everything sort of fits together, they can look at this and maybe get a little bit of a leg up, just because they know they're going to have this one really solid encounter, right, that they can use to anchor their campaign or their series of adventures, and they can then have a sense of what directions they might want to take to get up to that point. I think that if that happens, that's something I'll be pretty happy with.
Yes. Yeah. Me too. Well, we've done it again. We've made another successful episode here of Tabletop Babble, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to go right over to fantasticlairs.com, but they should also go find y'all on Twitter and the internet and things like that. So where can people find you, Scott?
People can find me on Twitter as Scott F. Gray, or at insaneangel.com.
Mike, where can people find you?
So my website, slyflourish.com, and my Twitter account, twitter.com/slyflourish.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble, but also partnering with me on this crazy endeavor that we have undertaken together.
It's going to be awesome. Has been awesome, and it's going to continue to be awesome.
And then join us next week when Mike and I will debate level 1 play lethality.
Liches just aren't appropriate for level 1 play. I don't know how
my mithril best-selling adventure says otherwise. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening to Mike and Scott and me talk about this awesome project. We had a blast creating it. There's a free preview you can check out now. All the information and links to the Kickstarter are at fantasticlairs.com. Go to fantasticlairs.com for all the information. Please check it out. This was such a labor of love. We've been working on it for a long time now, and I am glad to finally reveal it to you all. Also, if you want to help the show, head on over to Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review. If you leave a review, I will read it out loud. You can make me say anything you want right here on the show. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts right now, just open your app and boom, you can pop on over and do that. Also, I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/Intracasso, where you can support this show for $1 a month. That's like less than a quarter an episode. If you are interested in doing that, it also goes to support my work on World Builder blog and in other places. So go check it out at patreon.com/Intracasso. Thank you so much to those of you who are already patrons. All right, people, you can find me on Twitter at James Intricasso and at worldbuilderblog.com on the internet at large. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network, edited by Nate Paulzenga. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding DSPN with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Don't forget, RPGs are like sex.
Hey there, listeners. It's Shane.
And Ishan, your hosts from the Total Party Thrill podcast, the newest addition to the Don't Split the Podcast Network.
We talk topics that help you, dear listener, create and play better RPG games.
We have a back catalog of more than 150 weekly episodes.
And we got nominated for an Emmy for episode 11, Social Contracts.
In episode 154, we talked about crossing the moral event horizon. How evil is too evil?
We also recap our home games, like the 40k Rogue Trader campaign, Dynasty Unwarranted.
But that's mainly just you trying to kill us all. In your defense, our characters are greedy idiots.
Don't forget the 3 years we spent in Eberron playing Morning Glory, your 5th edition D&D campaign.
We also review new RPGs and books, and every episode we build a 5th edition D&D character in the Character Creation Forge.
You might check out the Pint-Sized Punisher from episode 119, a halfling with a bad attitude, and 14 levels of Barbarian.
So to recap, Total Party Thrill, RPG advice, campaign recaps, and D&D characters built by your dashing hosts every single week.
What more could you possibly want?
To get back to the actual show?
Oh yeah, let me just hit this button, and here you go.